Today, on Easter Sunday, we're talking about why the worst day of your life doesn't have to be the last day of your life. And what we mean by that is, most of the time, the worst day is not literally the last day of your life. Now, sometimes, of course, it is in a tragedy, where it is a person's last day of life on earth. But often what happens is, the worst day of our lives isn't literally the last day of our lives, but it's so painful that the memory of that event is seared into our brains, and we can get stuck in that moment. Was there like a noise or something? Sorry. I have allergies, so I can't really hear. Right now, you could heckle me and I would never know. Right now, I'm kind of stuffed up right now, but I think, is it gone now? Okay. We love our team here who are awesome at making all this stuff work properly. Thank you guys. But so you go through this painful experience, and you can get stuck in that day, in that particular area of your life. And you can do really well in lots of other areas of life. So, somebody could be, really successful, be a good parent, have a good job, have friends, or involved in a church, but in one area of their life, they're struggling. Maybe, whatever it was, 5 years ago, they had a bad relationship ending, a divorce, a breakup. And in that particular area of their lives, it's like they're stuck in that worst day. Do you see what I mean? And so in every other area of life, it can be really, really great. But in that one area, it's like they're stuck repeating that worst day. And now maybe they're in a new relationship, but that worst day comes back to haunt them. Or maybe they're skittish about starting a new relationship because that painful memory is there, and they're just kind of stuck there. It doesn't have to be one particular day. It could be a series of events that just kind of have a cumulative effect, and they add up, and it could be that you have a new mom, and being a new mom's hard, and she's just convinced that she's a bad mom, and she carries this guilt around that she's just not a good enough mom because she didn't know how to handle certain situations that nobody would, or something like that, and now she just carries mommy guilt. It's like she's just kind of stuck in that, and she always feels like a not good enough mom. Maybe it's a day that is easy to remember. Maybe a person had hopes and dreams, and they really went for it. Like they believed all the positive inspiration posters, and they just went for the dream, but it fell through, and they're disappointed. And now they struggle with self-doubt, and they're not sure that they can really, have the personal power to achieve what they want to achieve in life because they're stuck with the pain of that worst day. I've told this story before to folks who are regulars here at One Church. My grandfather was my father figure growing up, and he passed away when I was 16 years old. I was angry for at least 2 years. I was mad at life. I was mad at God. I wasn't ready for it. And for quite a while, I was stuck in that day, which is actually New Year's Day, January 1st, 1994. In that particular area of my life, and it affected my relationship with God because I was angry, because I assumed that, God, I blamed God for that somehow, and I was just kind of stuck in that day. Maybe a couple had an argument earlier in their marriage or a series of arguments, and it still affects them. The pain of that is still there. They're just kind of stuck in that day. Maybe a person went through a painful conflict at church, and they were disappointed. Maybe they were mistreated. And now it's very hard for that person to even set foot in a church building, even if it's actually an indoor trampoline park. It's still tough for them because of that painful experience. And they're just kind of stuck in that moment, stuck on that worst day. Well, what is keeping them stuck? And we all, I don't know what yours is, but we can all point to these particular ways that we're stuck in the last day. What's keeping them stuck in that last day is the defining story they believe about life. Their defining story. What is your defining story? By defining story, I mean what you really believe about life. And whether you can really live a fulfilling life and be happy and make relationships work and have financial, success and make your dreams come true, that kind of thing, it really is dependent on the defining story you believe about life. So here's how that can look. Similarly, you can have a really successful guy, we'll say, financially successful, And if you asked him, hey man, what's your defining story? He'd have no clue. Like, I don't know what you're talking about, man. But if you had a conversation with him about things that matter and his anxieties in life and his stresses in life, it would come out pretty quickly, actually. And maybe he drinks too much to deal with the stress. And it would come out as you talk with him that his defining story is something like this. Well, I just have to go pedal to the metal all the time. I'm driven because if I let up for 1 second, somebody else is going to overtake me. I'm going to lose it all. You see what I mean? That's his defining story. His defining story is one of fear. That if I let up for 1 second, somebody else is going to take all my stuff and I'll be a failure and a loser, and that's the worst thing that could ever happen to me. And so he's driven by some experience in the past, some belief, and that's his defining story. Maybe a young woman with children would have this defining story that in order to be a good wife and mom and take care of her kids, she has to give up on all of her dreams. She can't do all those things and take care of her family and also be personally fulfilled in her life. She'd be like, well, you can't have your cake and eat it too. And so she might be like some ladies who reach 45, 50 years old, and they look back over their lives like, wait a second, like I believed a defining story that just didn't work very well for me, because now I look back and I wouldn't change my family and all that. I love them more than life itself, but I have some regrets. If they're really honest, maybe even some resentments that I had these dreams and these hobbies and just things I was interested in, but I chucked it all because my defining story was I thought you couldn't have your cake and eat it too. And so there's this crisis because of a defining story. All of us have a defining story. When we face pain. When I was 4, my mom was ironing and she left the room for a minute. And I picked up the iron and I put the hot part of it down on my leg. Just like for a few seconds, but it burned my leg to where it scarred my leg for several years, actually. And so I didn't go anywhere near irons for a really long time. Probably had wrinkly shirts in college, because of that painful experience. When we go through painful experiences, our brains force us to remember that pain. Like putting your hand on the hot stove burner. And it makes sure that we don't do it again, and that's good. But it can go too far. And it can go so far that we won't even get near anything that remotely reminds us of that painful experience, even if it means we have to give up all kinds of good things. And we don't experience good things because that would involve some risk and vulnerability. And I'm like, nope, not going there again. That's a default defining story that's built in to the human brain. So if your defining story isn't powerful enough to get you unstuck from that worst day, you just kind of replay the pain in that one particular area of your life. So let me ask you, obviously a rhetorical question, what is your worst day? What's been the worst day? It may not be an actual day. It could be, something that you believe is just there for some reason. You don't remember why, but it's something that just, it blocks you from living the kind of life that you would really like to live, and a fulfilling life and a good life. And it's just kind of there in one particular area of your life, and it just kind of comes back every once in a while and haunts you. What is it for you? What is your worst day? And what is your defining story about that experience? And is your defining story powerful enough to get you unstuck? Well, one defining story is resurrection. The resurrection is a defining story. What we now call Good Friday was the worst day of Jesus' life. On that day, he was crucified. He was put to death using a form of execution called the cross that was used in the Roman Empire. On the night before, what is now Maundy Thursday, he was arrested. He was crucified on Friday under the authority of a Roman governor named Pontius Pilate. So we read about the worst day of Jesus' life in Luke chapter 23. 2 other men, both criminals, were also let out with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, they crucified him there, along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." A lot of people have become Christians because of that one phrase right there. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they divided up his clothes by casting lots. They gambled for his clothes. Verse 35, the people stood watching, and the rulers even sneered at him. They said, he saved others, let him save himself, if he is God's Messiah, the chosen one. The soldiers also came up and mocked him. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, for the sun stopped shining, and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Jesus called out with a loud voice, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And when he had said this, he breathed his last. From our perspective, in 21st century America, it's hard for us to understand what the cross meant. Why? I mean, obviously the physical pain would make it the worst day of a person's life, but it's even worse than that. The cross was designed to inflict the maximum amount of shame onto a person possible. It was meant to put a person up on display like a billboard and to say this person dared, do something that we didn't like, is the Roman Empire. And so the last memory you have of that person, the last thing their loved ones see is this person a beaten mess, publicly shamed and dominated with violence and done away with on this cross. It's absolutely the worst day that somebody could ever imagine. But in Jesus' life, there was a defining story greater than the pain and the shame of the cross. And it's a defining story that is shocking. It's surprising to people who didn't hear it. We find out that it was completely unpredicted. Nobody expected that. They hadn't talked about even the possibility of this kind of thing happening. It's a total game changer because it takes what could have been the worst day and it changes it into the first day of a new beginning. And we read about that in Luke 24. On the first day of the week, very early in the morning, the women took the spices they had prepared and went to the tomb. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they entered, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were wondering about this, suddenly 2 men in clothes that gleamed like lightning stood beside them. In their fright, the women bowed down with their faces to the ground. And the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, he has risen. Remember how he told you while he was with you in Galilee, the Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day be raised." Again, so the resurrection became Jesus' defining story. That's why we're here today on Easter Sunday, because that's his defining story. Nobody predicted it except for him, according to Luke. And the people he kind of shared the idea with didn't get it at the time. It's something they didn't see coming. They never believed it would have happened. And whatever your worst day is, isn't it true that it's really hard to believe that anything would ever really change that? Isn't it hard to believe that you could ever really break out of that pain? And that kind of that repeating song in the iPod of your head, that just kind of plays over and over and over, that pain of that. Isn't it difficult to even imagine how that could ever change? But as we think about Jesus' defining story, what would it look like if resurrection could become your defining story? In that worst day, that place of pain that you are thinking of. I've been leading a one group studying a book by Adam Hamilton called Making Sense of the Bible. It's an awesome book. And in one of the chapters, he talks about suffering and how, when we go through bad things in life, the number one question we ask, isn't this true? God, why would you allow bad things to happen? Isn't that true? We have that question. And he tries to deal with that question a little bit, and he also points out that, there are a lot of unhelpful cliches that people will repeat to you when you're hurting. Like, you'll share something that's, your worst day. And they'll be like, well, everything happens for a reason. How many of you have heard that one, right? And it's like, that's not helpful. I don't understand. I know what the person means, and they're trying to say something good, but what would that reason be exactly? And so there are people who try to help, but it's just not that helpful, because many people have an idea that God is sovereign over the world, that God's in control of everything that happens. And everything that happens, either God causes it or God allows it. And so that's the obvious question. Why would God do that? Well, perhaps, just pushing pause for a second and coming over here for a second, perhaps there are other views of God that are different from that idea of God, that God's just like this person behind the curtain pulling the levers. all the time. There's something called process theology. That's something you'd write down and read about later. Process theology. There are all kinds of different ideas about who God is. Next week, we're going to have a guest speaker named Doug Pagitt, who has written this book. It's called Flipped, the provocative truth that changes everything we know about God. If you come back next week, you'll hear Doug talk about some things that might challenge your picture of God and might help you have a picture of God that actually leads to healthier ways of dealing with the suffering in your life. So I want to invite you back for that. But here's what Adam had to say about what it means that God is sovereign, or that God is powerful, that God is in control. And the quote's on the screen, and whatever your worst day is, Adam writes, "The idea of God's sovereignty does not mean that everything happens according to the will of God, but that human evil, natural disasters, illness, and even death," I love this, "will not have the final word." Isn't that great? God will ultimately force good from evil, and his love and goodness will finally prevail. The truth is seen in the rebuilding that takes place in our lives and in the world after tragedy strikes, and in the hope of the resurrection when we see God face to face. That perhaps what it means on Easter Sunday to have faith in God and to say that God is in control somehow is not that God causes everything or even allows everything, but that God won't let your worst day have the final word in your life. Last year, a 73-year-old neo-Nazi fired into a Jewish community near Overland Park, Kansas. I lived in Overland Park for a year, about 12, 13 years ago. He killed 3 people. All 3 people he killed were Christians. One was a Catholic, and a 14-year-old boy and his grandfather were members of Adam Hamilton's United Methodist Church of the Resurrection. And since then, Church of the Resurrection has been forming a closer partnership with this Jewish community, and they've released a series of videos of stories that people in this Jewish community have told about their experiences being Jewish, in growing up and what that was like. And I'm going to show you a short video. It's about 1.5 minutes long. It's the story of Rabbi Arthur Nematoff. Something very painful happened to him in high school, but something good came out of that. So let's check out Rabbi Arthur's story. So think about the pain he experienced, lost his father, and then he goes to school, and he gets bullied by these couple of guys. I mean, think about the horrible things that could have come from that. Even hatred and bitterness. But instead, these 2 other guys stuck up for him, and all this good was raised out of this experience of pain. It's a good time to point out, as we talk about a Jewish rabbi and his experience. 2 weeks from today, we're starting a new series called Religions of the World, in which we're learning about the 5 major religions in the world: Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. On a couple of those days, at least, we're having guest speakers come in to talk to us about their faith. So on May 3rd, we're going to have a rabbi named Shmuley Yanklowitz. Newsweek named him one of the top 50 rabbis in the United States. He lives in Scottsdale. He's going to be here on May 3rd talking about Judaism. And then on May 17th, we're inviting a Muslim imam to come in named Khalil Sultan to talk to us about Islam and how, what's his experience being a Muslim in the United States right now. And so our world is full of religious conflict. Would you agree that if we could have some understanding and some conversation, that would be a really good thing in our world? Would you agree with that? And so this new series, Religions of the World, is about how to maybe bring, raise some goodness out of the painful conflict in religion in our world. So I don't want to minimize these painful experiences, these worst days, and sometimes it helps to look at other people's worst days as well and consider what they have gone through and kind of put yourself in their shoes as well. Last November, there was this Australian immigration official who had a really bad day. Did you read about this story? There's a G20 summit in Australia where almost all the most powerful leaders in the world traveled to Australia for this conference last November. And President Obama, Putin, Merkel, all of these world leaders. And there was one Australian immigration official assigned to take care of the passport information of all of these world leaders. You haven't heard the story? So apparently last November, the Australian immigration official sent an email, with all 31 world leaders' passport information, all of their personal information. And they were using Microsoft Outlook, which is already, you can see this is going to be a bad thing when you say Microsoft Outlook. They put the right email addresses in, but autofill added an extra email address, and they accidentally sent out all of the security information of the world's 31 most powerful leaders to some third party. Like totally blew the security of Barack Obama, Vladimir Putin. Can you imagine that day that Australian immigration official had? And isn't it comforting that the security of the world depends on Microsoft Outlook? There's a reason most people don't use that anymore. Like the email that would lead to world peace is stuck in the outbox somewhere. Right? That was my experience with Outlook, at least. I mean, can you imagine like that person's coworkers are going to call him Passport for the rest of his life? Like try to live that memory down, right? That's a pretty bad day. And it may not be, something like that, but whatever the worst day is, one choice for a defining story is the resurrection. And adopting the resurrection as your defining story turns your worst day into the first day of a new beginning. Your worst day can become your first day. Many of us grew up with the idea that the resurrection of Jesus, and the death and resurrection of Jesus, is about where you go when you die. Jesus died on the cross for your sins. He was raised from the dead so your soul can go to heaven someday. That's good, and it's life-changing, and I believe that, and that's part of the gospel, the good news about Jesus, but that's incomplete. There's more to it than that, and whatever your worst day is. The first followers of Jesus saw the resurrection of Jesus as something that changes things in the here and now. It changes the social order. It presents God's view of life, and it can have an effect on your life right here and now. A guy named Brandon Ambrosino wrote an article entitled Jesus' Radical Politics. Here's what he wrote. What's radical about Easter, then, is not that Christians claim a dead man rose from the dead. What's radical is what that means, specifically what it meant for Rome, and by implication, what it means for all kingdoms everywhere, including the ones we live in. Jesus' resurrection marked the end of Caesar's way of doing things. It established a new kingdom in which enemies are loved. The marginalized are given primacy of place. The poor are blessed. In this kingdom, hierarchies are subverted. Concentrated power is decentralized, and prodigal children are welcomed home. Isn't that beautiful? The resurrection defeated the violent, shaming tactics that were used by the Roman Empire and that are still used in our world. And maybe that's what led to your worst day. Maybe living in that kind of a broken world is what led to your worst day, and you were mistreated, and you were treated in a way that hurt you deeply. The resurrection has something to say about that now, in your pain. So the choice we have to make on Easter is, do you believe that there really can be a new beginning in that painful area of your life, in your worst day? Could the resurrection really be a defining story for you? With the news recently focusing on ISIS and what German wings and Netanyahu and where Hillary keeps her email and all these other kinds of things, one of the stories that's been kind of shut out is right now the Boston Marathon bombers on trial. And it hasn't gotten a whole lot of coverage, but you remember the Boston Marathon bombing happened almost 2 years ago now. It was this brazen act that cut our country deeply. When bombs were set off near the finish line of the Boston Marathon, they killed 3 people and injured 264 people. A manhunt began that ended 4 days later when this guy Tsarnaev was found hiding in a boat. And so now, it's not the big story in the news right now, but we're talking about it because we have 2 years of distance to see how these people have held up after this painful experience. And the Boston Globe profiled a victim of the bombing named Heather Abbott, and we have a picture of Heather. She lost her leg in the blast. I don't know if you can read what's in her arm, but she's written on her arm there, less leg, more heart. So that gives you some insight into Heather, right? So Heather was severely injured in the Boston Marathon bombing. So, Heather had a choice to make about how she would react to this worst day, I'm sure, of her life. And this was her choice. After the bombing, she returned to her job in human resources, and she started running again, even, with the help of a prosthetic leg. She even had a special prosthetic made so she could wear high heels to work. Like, she wanted to wear high heels that bad that she had a special prosthetic made, and she started visiting other people in the hospital. I mean, out of 264 people injured, there are a lot of people. And she realized that not all of them could afford a prosthetic leg. And so she started the Heather Abbott Foundation to help people with amputated limbs afford prosthetics like the one that she had, and help to motivate them to kind of live a normal life again. And the Boston Globe carried the story because she decided to attend the trial of Sarnaev just a couple of weeks ago. So she went into the courthouse and sat down there in the court area, and she didn't see him enter the room. And when she looked up, she realized he was there already. I'm just gonna read the quote. She looked up and realized he was there. She was startled by the sudden reality of it. As often as she had imagined it, she was still caught unprepared. She watched him from across the room, this stranger who had dropped a backpack full of shrapnel and explosives behind the crowd and then walked away. She was braced for anger, but no anger came. When you listen to the last sentence of this quote, he looked smaller than she had expected. Isn't that a cool sentence on the end of that paragraph? He looked smaller than she had expected. And she watched him throughout this trial, watching for his facial expressions, to try to get some glimpse into who he was and why he did this. And the goal was to try to make sense of that in her life. And long story short, as she watched him throughout the trial, she didn't really get any good glimpses of who she is, or of who he is. She realized he seemed indifferent. Didn't really care about all the horrible evidence that was presented. And she thought, I guess that kind of makes sense because he did this in the first place. So, I guess you wouldn't really expect him to be affected by that, but it showed her that when you're kind of stuck repeating that worst day, whatever it is for you, and maybe somebody else hurt you and caused that, the answer and being able to move forward is not found in trying to make sense of why somebody did this horrible thing. It's not found in them and hoping that you'll see something in them that will make sense of all this. That's not where the answer is found. She discovered that the answer was found in her. That what she needed to be able to make the choice to live out a resurrection story and be able to move on and come back to life and thrive after this horrible experience was found in her. It was her choice. Whether she wanted her defining story to be one of a new start, or if she wanted to be stuck in that horrible day, or stuck trying to figure out this murderer's mind. It's just a dead end there. But she made the choice that she wanted to let the resurrection be her defining story. They said since then she's spent little time dwelling on the bomber. She had resolved from the first days after the trial to look back, to take back the life she had before, conceding nothing. And so if you think of your worst day, or whatever that pain is in your life that you keep replaying, is your defining story one of resurrection? Easter Sunday is a great time to adopt a new defining story, to view it as a new beginning. Your worst day can become your first day. Would it be possible if that worst day is something to do with your marriage, that you could have a new beginning in your marriage or your relationship, and that worst day could be the first day? What if you could start a new spiritual connection with God? And maybe spiritual stuff's tough. Maybe it was hard to walk into a church service this morning. What if the worst day with religion and all of that, organized religion, what if the worst day could turn into a first day of a new spiritual connection with God, following the way of Jesus, adopting the resurrection as your defining story? What if dreams could be resurrected? Maybe you put them on hold. What if dreams could be resurrected? What if you could have a softer heart? What would that look like if your worst day caused you to have a hardened heart and be closed and really miss out on good things? What if your heart could be softened and given new life? What if you could trust again? What if you could release your grief and pain? And that worst day could become a first day. What if you could forgive and free someone in the act of forgiving, and then you realize that person you freed was you? Could your worst day become your first day. Thomas Edison said, our greatest weakness lies in giving up. The most certain way to succeed is always just to try one more time. What if your worst day could become your first day? Let's pray.